But I just wanted to welcome people. People will come in, I guess, as the afternoon wears on. But I would like, my name is Tarini Bedi, and I teach in the Department of Anthropology here. And with my colleagues Sultan Tepe and Rachel Weber, Sultan is in political science and Rachel is in urban planning. We're trying to get together sort of a broader intellectual community of people who are interested in urbanism, whatever that might mean, and I think it might mean very different things to different people, and across disciplines. And I think UIC is an interesting place because there is a lot of very interesting urban work going on among students and faculty. We just don't necessarily always, we're not always talking to each other. And hopefully we can expand this out of UIC too. I mean, there are lots of people working in other institutions and other organizations across the city. So in the interest of trying to, I didn't do this last time and I feel badly about it. I know all of you are on different kinds of mailing lists and things. But if possible, I'm going to send around a sheet of paper where people can just write up, give me their email addresses. Maybe we'll circulate things at some point, and as this working group develops a little bit more, we can, we can send out announcements and things. Does that sound like something that people would like to do? I know everybody gets, bombarded with emails, so I'm going to send around 2 pink sheets of paper because these were the ones that I could find. Okay, so for those of you, we will circulate other events that we organize. Hopefully, I'm hoping this will continue through, not just through this academic year, but also through the rest of the calendar year and beyond. And as part of this working group at the Institute for Humanities, there are several different sponsors of this event. Geez, I should have actually listed all of them, but I don't know who they all are. But they are the program for international study, the International Studies program, the Asian Studies program, the Asian American Studies program, the Institute for Research on Race, Politics, and Policy?
Institute for Research on Race.
Okay, see, you should have done this. All right, IRRPP is the institute here. So, there are lots of people who are interested in the kinds of things that we're talking about here. And we thought that it would be actually very interesting for both our students and our faculty to have Professor AbdouMaliq Simone visit us. And we were lucky enough that he happens to be passing through Chicago and has agreed to speak here. And Professor Simone is a research professor at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity and visiting professor of sociology at Goldsmiths College, University of London, visiting professor at the African Center for Cities, the University of Cape Town, research associate with the, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, how do you pronounce is it Rujak Center for Urban Studies in Jakarta, and research fellow at the University of Tarumanagara. Now, what is wonderful about AbdouMaliq Simone is that for over 3 decades he has worked with various different on topics of social interchange, cognition, local economy, and the constitution of power relationships that affect how African and Southeast Asian cities are actually lived. And I think his work has very unique resonance on a campus like ours because we are an urban institution, a university that's very engaged with the city that we live in. And his work really attempts to generate these new theoretical understandings based on a wide range of urban practices generated by cities in Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. And he also works very hard to integrate these kinds of understandings, theoretical understandings, into policy and governance, which I think is really unique. So he's not only a theorist and urban thinker, but he also works on all of these challenges of urban life, working with municipalities, training local government officials, designing collaborative partnerships among various different people who live in these cities, artists, politicians, residents, technicians, bureaucrats, etc., and I think any of you who have read his work will see the wonderful collaborative nature of his urban thinking. He's published numerous books that I think are now on urban studies syllabi across the world, and I myself have been very greatly influenced, I think, by many of your books that go back to the 1990s, in whose image Political Islam and Urban Practices in Sudan was the first thing I ever read by you. Then I always on my urban studies classes have your book, For the City Yet to Come, Urban Life in 4 African Cities. And numerous other books, I'm not going to list them. The most recent, of course, was your 2004 book on Jakarta. Is that the 2014, right? Okay, it's called Jakarta, Drawing the City Near, and it was published in 2014. And I also never teach a class on anything urban without using your public culture article from way back from 2004. I don't know if it's followed you around, I'm sure. I'm not sure whether you still agree with what you said. It's called People.
I don't remember what I said.
It's called People as Infrastructure, Intersecting Fragments in Johannesburg. And of course, another wonderful article which I actually now have on my urban studies syllabus, the one on in Theory, Culture and Society, which is called Deep into the Night, The City Falls While the Blacks Come Home to Roost. It's a brilliant piece of theoretical thinking, and he's very, as an anthropologist, I really appreciate how much Professor Simone actually brings human beings into his study of cities, which is actually quite surprisingly unusual. And what is very interesting is that these are people who don't always agree, in fact never agree, never speak the same language, and yet are able to shape the kinds of urban environments that they live in, often in very brutal urban environments. So without any more on you, I'll let your work speak for itself. I would highly recommend those of you who are not familiar with this kind of work. This is actually one of these urban scholars that I think most of us who are doing urban work should use it as an example, because he is trying to build urban thinking from outside the places that urban theory usually comes from. And I think that that's what makes the work stand out and very appropriate for what we're doing here. So thank you so much, Malik, and I'll invite you to present.
Thank you, Tali. Thank you for all coming out this afternoon. Thank you for the very generous introduction. What I want to do this. I mean, I've always been interested in urban collective life, what it looks like, what it smells like, how it operates, what it can and can't do, the different kinds of changes it go through. And to a certain extent, I want to sort of reflect upon the particular aspect of it that has to do with what we used to refer to as auto-construction. And by auto-construction, meaning a way in which residents built a way of life for themselves within the city. So sometimes it meant that they had to do it from scratch. They did everything, you know. Sometimes it was like sites and services. They were provided a site, the site was serviced, they had to do everything else. Sometimes the state provided a basic kind of layout, of which then, a basic pavilion, and then they completely changed it around. But it always is, in some sense, much more, auto-construction was always much more than simply building the physical plant of an existence, but it was a way in which to build a way of life that was capable of making things, of making one's own life, of making the lives of others, of making stuff within it as a kind of economy in which to keep the thing going. But it entailed a kind of sense of the capacity to make and to continuously make and remake. So I want to just run through some basic sort of reflections on now what happened to that. And particularly because now it's like, 2000, 2016, like in October, in a few months' time, there's going to be this thing called Habitat 3 in Quito in October. And Habitat 3 will be, once again, a kind of meeting of politicians, policymakers, technicians, you know, all the sort of people involved within running cities, urban development, that will gather again, once again, to reiterate a commitment to a more just city, a more equitable city, the rights for shelter for all, a way in which people don't got to be poor in order to live in the city. They will reiterate this once again, talk about the kind of policies and commitments necessary to do that. And this followed, like, you know, Habitat 2 in 1996 in Istanbul, and the first Habitat, which was in 1976 in Vancouver, which in some sense, that 1976, so all these years, those that are supposed to be doing the job of managing cities, of governing cities, of administering cities, of providing for cities, have in some ways been saying the same stuff all these decades, with all these kind of commitments, and in some ways the thing don't change all of that much. The city don't become much more public, the city don't become much more equal, or more just, or well-serviced, or less poor. And sort of ironically, in some ways, that first Habitat meeting in 1976, in some ways coincided with the beginning of the end of the public city, in a way. I mean, this was the beginning of the end, really, in terms of the way in which state, whether it be the national state or the regional state or the municipal state, really began its attenuation of a commitment in many ways to basically create cities that were in some ways inclusive of the inhabitants that lived there. And in some ways, so that, you know, the historian Fernando Coronel would say, you know, that the struggles for democracy are struggles about democracy. And increasingly, these auto-construction in some ways was a struggle about what democracy would look like. That is, in what ways do people have the kinds of capacities, the abilities, the power, the drive to both imagine and make a way of existing for themselves within cities that for them was in some sense reflected a kind of notion of democracy. It wasn't the pursuit of something that was formatted. It wasn't the pursuit of something already mapped out. It wasn't the pursuit of something of which people had already a clear idea. So in some ways, very much this notion of auto-construction is very much in some sense linked to the notion of a struggle about democracy, about what it could look like, what it in some sense could be. So in some sense then, it's a kind of constant oscillation of different forms of rule and the way in which these intersect. So of course then, you know, what makes the effectiveness of a particular kind of district? How does one sort of evaluate the efficacy of what people did construct and what did make? And of course there are many different factors to this, but what I want to emphasize in this kind of list of factors is that, but to how and what degree these dimensions are combined. It's this sort of notion of combination. How things get combined, how they get woven, how they get intersected, how they get sutured, how they get articulated in relationship to each other, which is in some sense the key thing. And that opens up all kinds of possibilities that districts will go and can go down different roads. Again, always keeping in mind the sense that when you make something, whatever is made can have many different kinds of dispositions, can have many different kinds of outcome. To make is not to format. To make is not to standardize. all right? Making always has with it its unanticipated results. Always the sense of a certain kind of surprise. Always the sense of something not expected, that challenges, that provokes. And in response to that kind of provocation, then in some sense people always responding to it. So what I'm interested in particularly is the notion of auto-construction across what I call the sort of middle latitudes of the black world. And I'm very specific notion of what I mean by blackness here. So I'm interested in this sort of the districts of auto-construction, say from Sao Paulo to Salvador Bahia to Dakar to Lagos to Nairobi to Khartoum to Mumbai to Karachi to Kuala Lumpur to Manila to Jakarta. I'm interested in this sort of middle band of what I call the black world, and blackness with some different connotations. Either cities that are sort of officially demographically designated, districts denigrated as black, as being populated by residents who are racially of African heritage, or districts that have been labeled in local vernacular as black. For example, in Mumbai, the attribution of particular areas of Mumbai as the black city. Or in Jakarta, the use of Kota Hitam, the reference to particular areas of Jakarta which blackness connotes a kind of sense of either opacity, blackness as a sense of things getting out of control. So in some ways, I'm interested in looking at this notion of the black world, and of course cities across the black world are not the same, but in some ways they can stand for each other's what might conceivably have been. That is, the locus of comparison here is not to break them down and to say, okay, the relationship between Sao Paulo and Dakar is this, these are the variables, but in some ways that each of them could possibly stand for what could have been possible in these particular cities. What might have been, what does Dakar say about what might have been possible in Mumbai? What does Mumbai say about what might have been possible in Dakar? So in some sense, this is the kind of link that I make amongst in terms of sort of speaking in general terms about some of the practices of the auto-constructed district, which I will get to. The first thing I want to emphasize, though, is that an integral part of the notion of auto-construction, of the making of a district, has to do with the imagination of what is possible. What is it possible to do under particular kinds of circumstances? And oftentimes it's very interesting then to turn to literature for the sense of the imagination of what it might be possible. For example, in Haiti, during the worst years of the Duvalier regime, during the late 60s and early 70s, there were several writers that called themselves, in some sense, the spiralists. And these were writers that refused to leave Haiti, even though they could have left Haiti. They absolutely refused to leave Haiti, and instead used their writing as a way to imagine a kind of urbanized Haiti in which it was possible for them to live, that is, to live despite the kind of arbitrary and violent rule of Duvalier. That is, imagining the possible in an impossible situation. And for them, it wasn't about making a kind of plan or a political statement. The spiral was not a statement, not a linkage. For them, the spiral was a kind of gathering up of things in a moment which they seemed to both collapse into and steer clear of each other. Not a device that places things in a respected or respectable position. Okay? That is, in their writing, they would put things together that just simply didn't appear to belong. They didn't hesitate to put together things that otherwise we would respectfully keep separate. whether it be sex or the church or religion or, I mean, for them, you gather up whatever it is that you have. You don't worry about, whether or not the things go together or not. You don't worry about whether or not these kinds of things look right or not. You know that they can't stay that way. You know that it doesn't have a long-term institutional life. But for that moment, the spiral is that kind of architecture of the imagination which says, yes, it is possible to think of a way of life that, despite what seems to be the empirical evidence around us, can be a kind of possible place of inhabitation. Or if you look at Jose Eduardo Agalusa's depictions of Luanda as in Angola, as it transitioned from a kind of super paranoid socialist state to a super paranoid capitalist one, the way in which he describes that no matter the form of rule, that Luanda is powered by a kind of blockchain of stories, a way in which in which coincidences form a kind of block, form a kind of solid whole, that are sort of crossings of inexplicable generosity and coincidence. You read his short novel Toward a General Theory of Oblivion, and it's just amazing the way in which people's lives in Luanda come together in the most inexplicable kinds of coincidences. But it was those kinds of coincidences that allowed the residents to survive years and years of civil war and foreign intrusions and an increasingly paranoid state. I mean, again, it's a kind of notion of imagination. There's a guy who just won an important French literary award, Fistan Mugila, Tram 83. It's a book basically about Lubumbashi, one would think. He's from Lubumbashi. And the whole book is just a series of details. It's just details. Page after page after page of details. You don't know what Tram 83 really is. Is Tram 83 a transport system? Is Tram 83 a bar? Is Tram 83 the city hall? You don't know, but it's simply the onslaught of details, the profusion of details that refuse any framing. They can't be framed. They can't be summed up. And if you think about residents trying to build something with having very little, often having to build something without the support of the state, without very many resources to mobilize, what was it that sometimes they actually had? They only had the details, the sheer details of their everyday existences with each other as something to work with, as something in which to imagine. I mean, given how hard it is to barely govern many cities, of course it's understandable just how many details of urban everyday life remain out of view, and how many judgments about districts and economies are based simply on the way that things look, or where details are valued only as specific data sets that are subject to complicated algorithmic calculations. But always remember, details are not simply proofs of some overarching abstractions. They're not simply instantiations of macrostructural dynamics. They're also evidence in their own right. And they constitute a way in which links amongst very different people and places and histories and materials can be interwoven and reworked. That is, they prompt combination. Details are the stuff of combination. How the combinations of details can make something in particular. Because remember I said before when I listed sort of the variables of what makes a district effective or not, it's not so much the content of the variables, but it's the way in which they can be combined. So how can things be combined? Also, the notion of density is that we think that density is about putting things in a limited amount of space. But it's also the formation of a particular kind of space. The way in which people, with their devices, their resources, their tools, imaginations, the way in which they're always able to act on each other. They push and pull on each other. They fold in and leave out, making use of whatever others are doing and paying attention to all that is going on, fighting and collaborating. That is, in some sense, density wasn't just in some sense, ground to floor ratio. It wasn't just about, you know, the economics of making things more economical or more efficient. It was a world in which people could act on each other. They could see each other, they could witness each other, they could not pay attention to each other if they didn't want to, but it was in some sense, density was a way of the possibility of things acting on each other, pushing and pulling. The problem now is that, in some sense, what's begun to happen is that in this paraphrase from an Argentine sociologist who looked during the Argentine crisis, particularly in cities, in the way in which people would get together to form new kinds of collectives, take over factories, build new kinds of businesses, organize cooperatives to seize buildings or commercial buildings or factories that weren't being used. And the kind of dynamism and the kind of vitality in which people did this kind of collaboration with each other. But increasingly what Gago warns us of is a kind of what she calls a neoliberalism from below. The way in which the state increasingly utilizes these kinds of energies, folds in these kinds of efforts as a way in which to, in some sense, I mean, the way in which the Argentine government began to mandate that the earnings that collectives were producing were folded into formal banking, the ways in formal banking systems. She makes a very interesting point, is the way in which the extraction economy of Argentina, that is, Argentina basically selling soybeans as a way to keep itself alive, instead of pursuing any kind of industrial manufacturing activity, begins to rely upon the sort of self-sufficiency of regions of Buenos Aires to make things for themselves to basically consume as a way to get the state off the hook so that it can, in some sense, convert most of its macroeconomy into the raising of soybeans. Also, again, the reality of finance as a kind of instrument of invasion. Finance is a kind of parasite. It's a parasite that takes place where they have no intention or even knowledge of going. But in imperfect synchrony with the economies of finance, with derivatives and securitization and debt swaps, increasingly the sociality of urban life posits an abundance of possibilities produced through tying up rights and opportunities to acquire specific quantities of things in the future at a fixed price, and an ineffable excess of alignments, indebtedness, and complicities and dissociable moving parts. That is, in some sense, the reality of financialization seeps its way through many kinds of auto-constructed districts as they themselves hedge their own futures, using some of the very language and the logics of financialization as a way in which they run their own economies. And then also to keep in mind, in terms of how Fred Moten and Stefano Harney put it within the Undercommons, is that whatever the popular does, whatever residents make, is always going to be stolen from. And no matter how much you're indifferent to that kind of theft, you can't ignore, in some sense, the way in which one's efforts are always being appropriated by those that are more powerful than you. So what then do you do as a result? So then, in some sense, urbanization itself, I mean, in some sense, to me, the sort of hegemony of urban capital has gained a certain kind of effectiveness because in some ways it mirrors the very logics of auto-construction. Because in some ways, urbanization keeps going in part because the auto-constructed efforts of popular districts and of residents within the part of the world that I'm speaking of basically was ripped off and mirrored as the kind of logic of urbanization as a whole in a significant sense. That is, what does the city make? Well, it makes itself. Urbanization as its own replicative outcome and extension. The ultimate realization of auto-construction. Okay, we know cities produce things. They do, and they continue to do so. And historically, they have consolidated labor and resources and infrastructure in dense proximities to facilitate the circulation of things, to facilitate the forward and backward scalar linkages, capable of accessing inputs from a broader expanse of origins and to propel outputs to multiple destinations and types of consumption. Okay, it does do these things. It does facilitate circulations of all kinds. It does consolidate labor. It does build infrastructure. It does all of these things. But while it still does all of these things, the urban seems to be increasingly its own product. The urban seems to be its own thing, that it produces itself as a kind of auto-gestion. It recreates its own sense of itself. So that value is something that has no value in the now, only in what it might become. So cities and regions become the occasion and vehicle to give rise to the unanticipated, to give rise to an excess of sociality, a purported abundance of opportunities for collaboration, the endless remaking of inhabitants, the conversion of space into nodes of new synergies. So value and profit is generated not so much from making things. Making things becomes less and less seemingly important, but rather putting things into all kinds of connections. Again, using the notion of combination as the kind of mode through which value is created. Constantly changing what any particular thing might mean, what anything might count for, or be used for at any particular time. That is always repositioning things in terms of new combinations, new kinds of connections. Changing the meaning of what things are through combining them with other things. So intensifying and extending this process almost seems to become the intent of urbanization itself. Okay? The thing that keeps the urban going. And in some ways, an example of this can be seen through the rush to build. Like in Jakarta, and in many cities of the so-called South, there is this absolute freneticism about building stuff. I mean, in Jakarta alone, in the next 5 years, 500,000 new units of supposedly affordable housing will have been built. 500,000 in 5 years. I mean, it's an incredible amount of built stuff within 5 years. So building new infrastructure of all kinds. Now, urban infrastructural development, it's not only a kind of guess on where the city is going, not only a guess on how it's expanding, where money is coming from, where investment flows are coming, but it seems that infrastructure itself also instigates something that both includes but goes beyond speculation. That is, this instigation posits infrastructure as something detached from reason. It seeks an adaptability to futures where no matter what happens, there's the possibility of recouping something from which itself can't be specified now. It almost becomes a way to go beyond time, to exceed time. For example, you talk to people, you talk to engineers, developers, real estate people in Jakarta, and you talk to and there's this rush to get stuff up because they're uncertain as to what's the price of labor going to be, where materials are going to come from, how are building things being hedged on financial markets. We need to do something now, or we might not be able to do it at all. And then you ask them, well, what are you going to do? And they say, well, it doesn't really matter what we do. It's like, just put up something now, and we know that it will do something at some point, But it doesn't matter to us if it's profitable now. It doesn't matter if we make money on this now. We know that within 5 or 10 years it will do something. What it does doesn't so much matter to us. We know it will in some sense do something. So in some way, this rush to build, it's not about making something specific. It's not about pursuing a particular kind of function. It's not about pursuing a particular kind of imagination. It's almost as if it's pure speed, as if whatever it is you're going to do it now, and somehow the value of it will only be clear to you sometime in the future. So much of the built environment that is converted into a kind of phantom of self-sufficiency. The closing off of the immediate surrounds in order that one might be part of a larger abstract global space. I mean, look at the way in which many mega developments are being advertised. It says, you know, move here and join the world. All right? Be a part of the globe. Be a part of, as if you're not living in the world already, you know, that you have to like put your ass in this new apartment block in order to be, you know, somehow be a sufficient person, a person that's really part of the globe. But of course these conversions are actualized through indebtedness as a prerequisite of viable urban habitation. You know, not too many people have the cash to put down right away on, so, and if you look at the kinds of ways in which people acquire stuff, I mean, it's not like people just go to the bank and take out a mortgage, because in many of these countries there's no mortgages that exist. So there are all kinds of very intricate borrowing systems that are mobilized, but no matter how intricate and reciprocal they may be, it is still the process of being indebted. And also the sense of joining the world, of having this kind of flat apartment that's yours, that's on the 40th floor, in which you're insulated from all the vagaries of the street. Just imagine how much violence goes into that. How much violence takes place in order for you to secure this kind of immunization against all of the uncertainties of the world in your 40th floor, 36 square meter studio, singly air conditioned and self-serviced with all you never have to leave kind of thing. Look how many work hours are extended. Look how many shifts are doubled. Look how many risky ventures are undertaken in order to create a horizon where waiting to earn money that is not already owed somewhere, either to brokers or contractors or family members, where it's not the norm, to be able to settle somewhere, you know, anywhere, somewhere, some. The thing I want to do is that, but in some ways, that these new spatial projects and infrastructures, they introduce new ways of inhabiting the city. They bring about new social forms. Households and neighborhoods are sliced and diced into particular profiles and assessments and niche markets and probabilities that are then catered to in terms of consumption opportunities. Or they're reassembled into more effervescent or provisional forms that need not take into consideration the social welfare of citizens or residents, but still generate value through precipitating new demands, new needs and desires. So they become financial and political hedges against the risk generated by exponential increases in the factors considered relevant to productivity and profitability. I mean, imagine you set out to do a business. Look at all the factors you have to take into consideration. What do you pay attention to or not? What's relevant or not? All the kinds of things that affect the outcomes of what it is that you do becomes much more plural, much more complex. So in some ways, new spatial products become a kind of hedge against these increasing kinds of risks. But in order to work, they require ways of visualizing and calculating how behaviors, events, personal conditions, capacities, and inclinations exert effects. Again, various combinations of variables. I mean, look at the way in which each of our lives is broken down into our various kinds of behaviors, our various kinds of histories, our risk profiles, where we've been, what we've done, what we're interested in. And in some ways, that's what I say, we're sliced and diced into these kinds of inclinations, these sort of aspirations and tendencies of which we're no longer, in some sense, the coherent entity for. So in some ways, we're producing all different kinds of forms of sociality, which we're not the authors or the engineers of. But it is these kinds of rampant new forms of sociality which become, in some sense, what these new spatial products are being addressed. How do you create new niche markets? How do you create new kinds of desires? You know, how do these new socialities reflect new ways of being and desiring in the world, of which individuals are not really even at the center of? So sociality is something that's continuously resculpted as the excess that potentiates continuous accumulation. So new forms of housing become a device in the refiguration of the social, in part to domesticate a new urban body, but also to instigate unforeseen, presently non-representable modalities of the social. Again, infrastructure not representing a social body that is already mapped out, already known, already represented, but infrastructure as an instigation to produce socialities of which we don't yet have a language for, that we don't yet have an image for. Okay, that's the, in a sense, that is in some sense a major kind of transformation. Again, a notion of excess, urban as excess. But then, okay, I've talked about this already. Of course, this raises issues of control. That is, who controls the excess? Who can steer the value of this excess? If city life is not about disciplining bodies or fitting people into set categories, if it's not making definitive distinctions between work and play, private and public, then collective life can take all kinds of different directions, all different kinds of forms. So control and the profit effect generated by effective control comes at the level of effective decision making. That is, if collective life can be somehow excessive, well then who's going to control that? Who defines it? All right? And the level of power, the locus of power, comes in terms of the mechanism of decision making. Who and what decides what this excess will be? And in part it comes through new processes of formalization. That is, the continuous monitoring of bodies in action, from smartphone applications that are able to identify where you're at any particular time, from compulsions to communicate the most mundane events via social media, which then are subject to a evaluative system of likes and dislikes, to the storage of data and personal communication on cloud structures of uncertain sovereignty. Who owns these cloud structures? Where are they actually located? Which in turn offer continuous probabilistic weightings of optimal pathways and decisions for individual users to pursue. All of these are mechanisms to reformalize the relationship between individuals in the city. So as the state becomes an increasingly outmoded mechanism of representing social life, as it becomes an increasingly outmoded mechanism of making decisions about social life, we have all of these new apparatuses of formalization which in some sense make decisions for us. So why are we lured? Why are we lured into these kinds of mechanisms that make decisions for us? Well, at a time when more people think that images are present in cities and regions at any time, I mean, it becomes difficult to know exactly what to pay attention to or not. So the appeal of making relationship matters of competition intensifies. I mean, there's so much to pay attention to. What do we pay attention to? If so much is relevant, what do we pay attention to? Our cognitive capacities can only hold so much at a time. So in some ways, we're lured into this kind of reformalization of urban life through the apparatuses of having decisions made for us, because in some ways, if we decide, how are we to decide? To whom do we turn? How do we evaluate? What's relevant or not? What do we rule out? What do we consider not worth paying attention to? And so a notion of deep relationality becomes something as control. Deep relationality is no longer the interplay of spatial variables that broadens decision-making and participation. deep relationality is no longer characteristic of those kinds of auto-constructed districts where relationships were built over many years so that people could be resilient in all different kinds of ways and decide together in all different kinds of ways. Rather, it becomes a kind of mechanism of control, about making data interoperable so that patterns of rainfall, traffic flow, water usage, capital budget allocations can all be brought into some kind of quantitative relationship with each other, which in the long run then introduces greater uncertainty. That is, what's really ironic about these new modes of formalization, these new apparatuses of decision making, which are supposed to be able to handle large quantities of data and make interoperable forms of data that we usually wouldn't be able to make a relationship between, is that algorithmically it creates as much uncertainty as it does certainty. So the very tools and mechanisms that we depend upon to make things more certain embody within them the possibilities of things that we can't compute, that are incomputable, that are uncertain. So then, what is then what? So if the increasingly abstracted time of capital circulation remains full of uncertainties that threaten to make the economic underpinnings of the city unworkable, then whose responsibility is to keep things hanging together? Does dispossession become a generalized condition? Does dispossession become a kind of mode of planning? So once again, then, it is the fraught and increasingly vulnerable everyday efforts and ethical work and cooperation and devices and experiments of the majority, those that created these back again to those that created the auto-constructed districts. Those again, the majority, the upper poor, the lower working class, the lower middle class, the majority of inhabitants of these cities across the sort of middle latitude of the black world, again falls upon them in some ways to keep the city going, but who don't recognize themselves in any specific form or set of rights, that have to use whatever is around to make themselves known or to make themselves invisible. Their work continues to provide productive and affordable residential and commercial settings, but again under increasingly fraught and vulnerable and difficult circumstances. So here I just I have some quotes from, well, I drink the water of the way in which people, in some sense, define their own situation. So that somehow this kind of practice of auto-construction has to, in some ways, take different kinds of forms, different kinds of modalities of operation, in order to, in some ways, in order to persist. And I want to just run through. I want to run through some basic, what I see, some of the basic moves in which this takes place. So, how to see. That is, there's a certain thing about how to see. That is, to create a mode of appearance for a place that enables different kinds of residents and operators and external actors to write themselves into the story. A place where different actors look upon a place or within it and that they can recognize and see something of themselves. Less a statement than form of living with. That somehow when they look at a place, that in some ways they can recognize themselves within it. To break up a sense that a place is either on the upswing or in decline. That things work or don't work. So to keep as many options open in terms of forging relationships of almost any kind to the larger urban world. That is, in some ways, to keep ambiguous whether or not a district is coming up or a district is going down. Somehow to, in some sense, not issue all kinds of statements about we're on the upswing or there's a crisis here that we have to manage. You find within you find within in the enduring auto-constructed districts a kind of sense, a reluctance to make statements about things. And that's important because somehow these were communities, these were districts where you didn't want to make a kind of strong statement about who you were. I mean, we all knew each other. We all knew our different proclivities. We all knew our sexual orientations. We all knew what the rules were. We all knew that some of us were transgressing those norms. We all knew that some of us weren't following the program. But that was all right, because those of us who weren't doing it had a kind of different take on things, and we might have had a different kind of relationship with the larger city, and we might have different kinds of networks. And those kinds of relationships were important because they were different from what other people had. So that what the things that other people had ran into trouble, there are other ideas and other things to turn to, not just the normal way of doing something. So, like in Jakarta neighborhoods, I mean, if you're a couple, you're supposed to be married. And of course, God forbid if you're queer. But neighborhoods were full of unmarried couples and queer people, but there was never a sense of people having to make a statement about it. Everyone knew what everyone else was in a certain way, but everyone could then write themselves into it. Somehow the notion of making a statement was to make a kind of claim on something which somehow would exclude someone else. So it was always important as a way of seeing, not to make too many statements, as a way to think, all right, I can see myself in this place. All right? So you allow for a kind of heterogeneity of different actors and activities to take place because they see something about themselves within that place. And also the notion of keeping things ambiguous in terms of where a place is going. Because if everyone has a kind of boosterism about, oh, we're doing so well here, in some ways you make yourself vulnerable. So it was always the question of how can people in their actions appear in ways that enable them to be relatable, but at the same time, where the differences, this broadened relationship, do not necessarily implicate the bearers of those differences as responsible for each other or dependent on each other. How can residents in a district enact their ways of life such that they are known by others, but where that knowledge is not construed as a commentary about the manner in which specific lives are conducted? So as I said, this is a matter less of statements, less of lines of articulations. Rather, it's finding a kind of aesthetics, a kind of way of making things look that enable things to become simultaneously visible and invisible to each other, where a definitive line between them is not possible to discern. I mean, we all know that it's important not to show everything that it is that we are or that we do. You know, we were having this talk before about secrecy, about transparency, and the importance that in some ways you have both. These were districts where there were limited opportunities to withdraw or hide the critical features that might define the appearance of any resident, which also lessened the need to make statements about identity since everything appeared more or less in common view. At the same time, what appeared in such a public perspective was constantly dependent upon the particular positions that bodies assumed while being viewed. And if you look at the built environment of these places, they were all over the place. It wasn't a kind of grid system where, you have these kind of lines like this, and wherever you stood, you assume you're viewed in a particular way. Everyone sees you quite literally in the same way. These were districts that were literally built there's a joke in one about how in this one area people had a hard time at night because the buildings were so jumbled that when a wife went to go to the bathroom at night, she ended up in some other bed of the couple next door because the way in which things were so jumbled that you couldn't be seen in one particular way. You were always literally and physically viewed in many, many different kinds of ways by virtue of the way in which the built environment was built. So to be public wasn't to be public as a kind of single point of view. Publicity meant the possibility of all different kinds of angles on you, all different kinds of ways of having different kinds of perspectives on what each other was doing, which made any definitive judgment very difficult for people to do. So it was an ethics where residents gave each other the space to go off into different directions in terms of what they did with their time or income or conduct small experiments without residents rushing to conclude that these actions had or would have dire implications for their own lives. That is, I mean, I know you. I know what you're doing. I know what, you know. But there's a kind of ethics which in some sense, and we could work together, we maybe live across the street from each other, but to a certain extent, I act towards you with a certain kind of indifference. Because I accord you the space to do something that I don't necessarily, that whatever you do doesn't necessarily have an impact on my life. See, because if I always think that what you do is going to have an impact on my life, I'm going to seriously try to control what you do. You know, I'm going to try to make sure you do this and this and this. But if I act as if it doesn't really matter, I give you that space. I give you that space to cultivate relationships with the larger city that I don't have. I may need those things. And all of us may need each other's things in that regard. And this became a kind of ethical position. Also, in some sense, don't bother with the self. And by this I mean that if I began to look at a sampling of different districts across different cities and those that endure, and I find that those that endure are ways in which people, they move in, they wear, basically to make this point simple, they wear different hats at different times. Of course, again, we all know each other. All right? But you may belong to this political party, you may be part of this prayer group, you may be part of this political association, you may have this business, you might belong to this commercial association, and you and you and you. And we all know each other, but we don't necessarily always know which hat we're wearing at any given time. Now, if we don't know what hat we're wearing at any given time, we're damn sure that people on the outside may not know either. So it's always, in some sense, a process of keeping people guessing, in a way. Because we circulate through different kinds of roles, you see? We're not invested in one particular kind of identity, one particular kind of... And this, again, gives us different kinds of options. So as I say here, claiming becomes a means of piecing together different vantage points on what's going on, different kinds of access to resources and opportunities, where people can pursue highly particular agendas through connecting with all these different kinds of collective formations, but without a sense of owing anything or aligning agendas. And again, it doesn't mean there's no conflict, but what usually happens is particular projects spin off in all different kinds of directions. Also, don't become cartoon figures of danger. Be about something, even if you have to make it up. Because outsiders often treat districts as something unknowable, where no one can be trusted, occludes and eventually wears down ways of dealing with mundane institutional practices that are actually well known and accessible. Like, I mean, compare this neighborhood in Bandra to a place like Lieri in Karachi. Now, Lieri in Karachi was like somehow, because of its locational advantage in the center of Karachi, prime real estate, close to the port, a large working class population that over decades and decades and decades built really strong institutions. And people knew these institutions. But what happened over the past 10 years? It constantly became redefined as something unknowable. All right? Something that was dangerous because it was unknowable. We don't know how many terrorists are hanging out there. We don't know, you know. That is, the unknowable became an excuse as a way basically to try to wipe it out. So in some ways, yes, you have to straddle these lines where you have to be ambiguous about what you are, but you also have to be, you have to also be about something, all right, as well. Even if you make it up. And then update, 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 update. Residents know they can't sit still, so they continuously have to redescribe their aspirations and capacities into new formats. You always are having to do something different. And let me just, before I stop, just give you an example of what I mean by this. So, okay, there are moments where, because of housing backlogs, okay, there's no choice but for people to now live vertically. And as I said, in Jakarta, there are 500,000 new units, you know, are going up. And it's very interesting is that some of these new vertical units are being set right in the midst of some of the most famous, well-developed, auto-constructed neighborhoods within Jakarta. So in some sense, what happens? What does it mean to update in this particular kind of instance? I mean, you're forced to live in one of these 36 square meters at most, prefab, cost you about $50,000 to get. Okay, as life becomes more complicated within urban districts. I mean, it used to be that in some ways, how do you raise money? How do you kick back money in terms of keeping the district going? So oftentimes in popular districts, value was calculated in terms of a wide range of provisional linkages between different kinds of activities. Where space is created to accommodate different ways of doing things and securing livelihood and consolidating particular collective identities, we're often subject to various kinds of unofficial taxations. Sometimes it's shakedowns, sometimes collections from different institutions. But this was particularly the case when you had factories that pretended to be boarding houses pretending to be factories, offices pretending to be single-family homes, and single-family homes pretending to be offices. So always under the radar, always with certain kinds of levels of dissimulation, but vulnerable because of it in some ways. But the quantity of what was to be extracted, the fees that you had to pay for doing all these kinds of businesses or living in this kind of auto-constructed way, always had to be recalibrated in terms of the impact on what it is what you're doing. I mean, I can't shake you down completely because then I have nothing to shake down no more. So I have to keep you alive, and I have to and I have to use what I take from you to feed back into the situation in which we all share. But increasingly, residents keep saying, you know, all this effort that we spend with each other, how do we assess it? How do we assess the value of what we do? It's becoming harder and harder for us to do it. All the efforts that we make, all the labor that we do, it ain't easy. You know, the time it takes to get to work, the traffic jams, the kind of labor-intensive kind of stuff, the kind of money we have to spend for school fees, it becomes difficult to assess what does our work actually, how do we really assess the value of it? So it becomes difficult. All right? So in some ways it ushers in the need for more precise calculations as to the value of everyday labor, available assets, and expected profitability. So, okay, so these new forms of vertical living are supposed to constitute the sort of the new modern nuclear family that goes about its business. That don't worry about making stuff with nobody no more. You on your own, you got your job, you're living on the 40th floor in your perfect 36 square meter apartment with your perfect 2 little kids, your perfect marriage, or your young professional kind of hipster lifestyle, and that's what's supposed to be addressed here. But this is inoperable at the moment in terms of being able to actually make the massive rolling of the so-called affordable housing viable. So in some ways, you have this kind of what I call the epistemology of the quantification of the vertical. That is the space floor levels. In some sense, it becomes easier to evaluate the labor that you do by virtue of you, oh, I have an asset. I have an asset I own. I paid this. This is mine. I'll sell it for something. My labor was worth something. But the reality is that with that 500,000 new affordable housing coming up, you think this is all going to be filled by the nice, happy couple with their 2 little kids, or your... No, it's not going to work. It's not going to work like that. So in some sense, when I say update, 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 residents are using the language of a certain kind of financialization as a means in which to begin to inhabit these new buildings. But in order to really inhabit them in a viable way, they don't live as, you know, the happy couple with the 2 kids, or the single young professional. You have groups taking over whole floors, all right? You have women Muslim prayer groups that raise money, borrow money, and then they take over the 35th, the 34th, and 37th floor, and the group moves in. And the group is there. Or you have different formations of, you have people who run informal markets. They take their earnings from the informal market, they buy up a couple floors. To the extent that you can do it in a prefab apartment, they tear down the walls. All of a sudden you have a huge living space for so the insides of these buildings become something completely different. But you use the language of financialization as a way, as a ticket into experimenting with new ways of making something. Of course, not in the same way that you could in a kind of popular neighborhood. There are constraints. But you continue to try to keep the spirit of that kind of auto-construction alive, using a new kind of format and using a new kind of built environment, and trying to do something different with it as a way in which to keep these kinds of possibilities alive. Let me just leave it there, okay? Thank you very much.
We have a few moments for questions. Comments.
I haven't thought this all through. Thank you very much for this. That was a performance. This was a presentation. And so stimulating, and so many great ideas. I guess I have a lot of questions, or comments. And one relates to, I think, and you may want to try to explore this or show that there may be some sort of parallel, but something that I've been doing work on recently is the issue of crowdfunding, which, in some ways kinds of, like you were saying, kind of capitalizes on sort of sociality and affect and communalism, but kind of through the language of financialization, that, there's all different kinds of crowdfunding. There's like, help my friend with his medical bills because he's an artist and doesn't have any insurance. And then there's crowdfunding, these new platforms that are raising, millions and millions of dollars to build these very buildings that you're showing. The kind of high-rise construction in neighborhoods that had otherwise been written off, right? So there's a taking of risk. And it's really hard to sort of figure out kind of what these things are all about, because there's sort of so many layers to them. Like you're saying, on one hand, there is a kind of communalism that takes place, and through these platforms, people can talk to each other. They can share their knowledge and wisdom on what's happening in a particular neighborhood. And yet they're also being, and I wanted to see it as just an example of being co-opted by power structures. And I guess that's where I don't know where the power lies, sort of where the bottom up ends and the top down begins, and trying to sort of make sense of these kinds of phenomena. I was just wondering if you had any, just sort of insight into, how we even need to kind of judge them. Do we even need to say, kind of take the curtain off and show the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain, or, you know, like that there is still these, you know, destructive capitalist power relations that are kind of underlying this, because you're talking a lot about sort of a they, and I don't have examples, you know, that I wrote down, but I guess agency in terms of, is it necessary to identify somebody behind the scenes kind of pulling the power levers, or is it just enough to say, like, that these kinds of systems have different faces, and sometimes they're this and sometimes they're that. I don't know if that's super, I feel like I'm not being so coherent, but the issue of agency and sort of who's doing these things. Is this just are these sort of system-wide? Is it a critique of the state? Is it, you know, in these situations where we have kind of bottom-up and top-down kind of colliding, yeah, is it sort of necessary to point out sort of where the different kinds of nodes of power are?
No, I mean, I think it is. It's just I mean, it would be amazing if you could mobilize like scores of researchers working together somewhere that set off from different sort of vantage points and try to reach each other from those vantage points and see the kinds of trajectories of decisions and money flows and authority and because when you try to think you pull back the cloak, I mean, if you try to pull back the cloak just on the property development business in a place in Jakarta, you have so many things to pull back, you know, one curtain more, then another curtain more, and then when you think that you get somewhere, you begin to see real messy kinds of conflicts between those that are supposedly the critical kinds of brokers, the critical kinds of elite, the ways in which the kind of cutthroat undermining of people with money and power operate, and the extent to which within those interstices there are these kinds of momentary spaces where things sort of slip through and do get done. What does it mean? What does it mean in a city where 30% of the budget is chopped, basically lost to all kinds of payoffs, all kinds of kickbacks, all kinds of where does the money go? And you begin to follow that money, and okay, 65–70% goes to stuff like this, but 35 to 40% goes into unexpected places, and places that it would never go to if it were just simply formal budgetary, municipal budgetary allocations. So it becomes so messy in one ways. You want sort of transparent, accountable governance. You want to know exactly how decisions are made, and your conviction in that would seem to then produce a kind of more equivalent allocation and access to resources and possibilities of living. But that's not necessarily the case, you see. All those twists and turns, all those kinds of murky deals produce all different kinds of dispositions. But it's because of those murky dispositions that global capital manages to find its way in, to instantiate its way into long developed, long cultivated practices in local institutions that aren't necessarily the logic isn't necessarily that. But at the same time, if we disentangle those things, what are the implications there? So yes, it's so important to understand them, but how can you bring to bear, you know? I mean, in a city like Jakarta, I don't know. I mean, we all are, I don't know if people are all familiar with what's going on in Barcelona at the moment, but one sees a lot of optimism for the way in which the social movements in Barcelona, through a lot of very hard work, managed to have taken control, at least sort of, over the municipal state, with a sense of strong ethics, a sense of strong conviction. And the thing is that Barcelona politics isn't the kind of politics that is amenable to the way in which most of the cities that I'm talking about have done politics and made a life for themselves over the past half-century. It may be that only as those areas are effaced and that more and more people have to live in situations like this, that the Barcelona politics will be possible. But then what is there something significant that's been lost in that? So it hovers in these always complicated kinds of, so you, on a day-to-day level, when you're dealing with sort of municipal institutions, you know, and they just want to be able to get through the day without a crisis, and they want to sort of find ways to mobilize some limited buy-in by a constituency they don't really understand, and a constituency that really doesn't understand them. How do you begin to build those kinds of relationships, let alone the kind of, where's the big power coming from? But of course, your question is, of course, so important and significant in this regard. But in places like Jakarta, in Sao Paulo, Mumbai, Karachi, to open the curtain opens onto a really messy situation. Capital is really messy at that level, as it begins to try to instantiate itself in many different sectors, in many different geographies, and it's not seamless. And it's maybe important to try to understand as best the kind of conflicted situations amongst the elite and the brokers as a way to, how can you manipulate the situation, as a way to win space, or at least to undermine some of their own confidence that they can simply act with impunity.
I don't think it's just a Jakarta phenomenon, too. I would say a lot of what you just said applies to the city of Chicago. So I don't think it's, you know, first, third world kind of division too, but it's that unmasking is really hard, even when we think we have more formalized systems of governance or economy.
Well, I have, you know, thank you again. Yeah, I want to second that. This was just incredibly provocative. I guess I have maybe a related question, you know, and this is of course based on, you know, I don't know Jakarta, I don't know the political, the way in which these things work. I've learned a lot from this talk about Jakarta. But in, say, places like Mumbai where I work, this idea of sort of this combination and connections and these kinds of things, and the messy way in which capital sort of, you know, proliferates at these, the bottom or the lower levels of the city. I mean, the state is by no means a benign actor. And it's sort of interesting because I'm not sure even that the state, and I wonder what, you know, with say, particularly housing, for example, it's the municipal government, the municipalities and things, but there are so many other state-like actors which are incredibly important within these sort of connections, I mean, you can do nothing in India without some low-level politician. It's not just the municipal, but it's actually elected politicians, political parties, and things like that. So I'm wondering, in your examples, where do you actually think of, or how do you actually think of the state? You know, and I think that rather than a top-down or bottom-up kind of perspective, I mean, the state is incredibly bottom-up or present at the very lowest levels of this kind of brutality, or these kinds of both enabling and disabling these kinds of practices. I don't know if I'm being entirely coherent.
No,
but
you are.
it's
You're right.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, where do you see there is this idea of connection, and so, you know, the social, which I think is so incredibly important to this kind of story in these cities. But I'm not convinced that the state, in fact, the state has emerged as even more present in this opaque environment. And the certain actors of the state are unable to penetrate these opaque urban districts, but there are so many other actors who are able to navigate these, that have taken on state-like function or state-like practices, and have become, in many ways, governments of their own. So I think that's sort of what I'm trying to get my head around here, is that where do you see, or how do you see the state as an analytical register, but also as a practice among these actors in these incredibly, as you say, I think that idea of you know, the blackness and the incapacity to navigate, but there are always these navigators that emerge and take on powerful positions. So that's I don't know if this is a question or a comment, but I think it's very provocative. I think what you've just discussed is incredibly provocative of how those of us who are looking at these kinds of urban environments in various parts of the world. I mean, Chicago, I think, is, you know, there are many urban thinkers in Chicago who sort of, you know, Mary Patillo has done some really interesting, the sociologist has done some very interesting work in neighborhoods on the south side of Chicago, where there are these power brokers in places where the state cannot reach, but they have taken on state-like function. So yeah, you don't have to, I don't even know if that's a question. This is just me thinking through some of the provocations that you've actually instigated in some ways.
No, because in some instances the state operates as a kind of hinge.
Right.
You know, as a kind of hinge which opens and closes the angles on the door with particular kinds of openings.
Right.
Because you have actors that have titles.
Right.
I mean, at the lowest level, you have, you know, a kind of in Jakarta, someone who's a state official who manages 36 households, and then, you know, you go up and you have 36 becomes, and they have a formal position. But their power, it gives them a platform through which to exercise a different kind of power. For example, you know, in these sort of self-created markets, which in Jakarta feed, you know, these self-created markets which feed about 1/3 of the population.
Sure.
The municipality, the state says, this should be our role. We should take it back. Of course, you know, food provisioning, marketing is a municipal function. We should be able to manage, control it, get the fees from it, proceeds. It can't be a sort of self-constructed thing, even though we have no idea how to run it, but these people run it. So the state wants it back. But it's actually the state that's running it, because all of the major players within that market are state officials, but not operating within a state capacity. But it gave them the opportunity, it gave them the platform through which to help to organize and to mobilize support and labor for the creation of this, but they didn't do it within the capacity of their official state role. So yes, you're right, the state operates in a multiplicitous ways, and almost times as a kind of hinge or a way to fold in processes which it doesn't understand or can't control, or to simply leave it up to those that they can foresee some kind of complicity with, to manage it on their own. So you're completely right. But oftentimes it is, why then are those that are officially part of the state, why do they spend oftentimes most of their time acting in a capacity which is not formally that of the state? Because in some ways they see the limited traction that the state has within the world in which they have to, the way in which they have to operate.
Well,
but they can be interlocutors. Right. They're translators, and they can acquire a great deal of power from that, from that role.
Right. I mean, it almost seems like there really is no outside to this. I mean, this is very common in the global South, right? That state actors are constantly acting. They both act inside and outside what might be the formal state. And in fact, in Mumbai, for example, state, housing development projects and things, you have the state official, on one day doing, actually supporting it, on the other day bashing down the same house. So it's kind of, that's the complexity, which I think is, so I'm wondering whether whether there is any outside, when you're thinking about the social, whether one can even think about the social as outside the state. I mean, I think this is really just my own grappling with sort of my own analytical problems. But I'm wondering, in these kinds of urban environments, whether there is an outside at all, whether you can think of, whether you can even talk about the social as outside state-like practices.
No, I mean, I think that there are state institutions that are complicit with the sort of proliferation of multiple socialities of which it cannot understand or control, but yet feeds off of, but yet exists in part through, because in some ways our understanding of the kind of modality and the structure and the form of the state is no longer adequate to the field in which it is to govern. And I think in some ways the state recognizes that.
What's happening in Brazil with the oil construction, with the Olympics in Rio, and the corruption crisis that's occurring now in Brazil, in the cities of Rio and Sao Paulo? Has there been any changes in any relationship between the ambiguous oil construction communities and the state or the political parties that exist that are basically fighting there?
I mean, I don't know the situation in Brazil all of that well, but there is a generational. So the kinds of victories that were won by the social movements, say in the 20, 30 years ago, which got security of tenure, got a house in the periphery, got in some sense particular kinds of social rights, the rights to the city, a place to live. You look at the third generation now, you look at their grandchildren and their particular aspirations for the city. They don't want to be there. They don't want to be on the periphery. What they won, those kinds of districts that they won are already in some sense collapsing. They never really fully became urbanized in the sense that they had anticipated. So the grandkids trying to find a way back into, and particularly in Sao Paulo, back into the center in some way. And trying to reinsert themselves back into the center. And in some ways this is very racially marked. There's a certain kind of alarm that says, oh, you know, I mean, it probably is just coincidence, but what's really interesting is that the intensification of the whole Workers' Party scandal comes at the time when the majority of Brazilian cities have officially become black. That is, all of a sudden, Sao Paulo is a majority black city. Rio is a majority black city. So, and somehow coupled with the sense of either trying to maintain a foothold in the center from being pushed out to the periphery, or those that thought that they won their rights by having security on the periphery, who now want to get back to the center in some ways. This, I think, is fairly racially marked, and in some ways doesn't I mean, I'm not quite sure what the future will be about that. But circulation is a big issue. I mean, the bus strike was a big issue because in some ways the value of young people to be able to circulate and not be stuck in the peripheries where their parents were stuck was a major issue. And how do you circulate? You circulate through the kind of public transportation that in some ways that you have available. And who organized those? Look at one of the groups that was very instrumental in organizing those bus strikes, those bus movements. The 40,000 young guys who are messengers on bikes who know every inch of that city more than anyone else. And who are the ones who ride those bikes? Well, they tend to be black Paulistas. So in some ways, there are those kinds of, and this is going to be an increasingly fraught political issue, because in Indonesia, in Mexico, it was all of these families that bought into these, you know, have this house on the periphery. I have my house. It's mine. I have my asset. Okay, so I have to commute 2.5 hours from work. So I don't know who my neighbor is. So I'm scared to send my kid to the playground that the developer built across the street. So the house begins to disintegrate after 5 to 10 years. So if I'm stuck in the middle of nowhere, where is it that I go? So you find this kind of effort to try to get back into parts of the city which are much more dynamic, much more urbanized. That kind of dream of having your own house tended to be, but it's difficult because you're still saddled with debt. You know, you still owe $35,000. How are you going to pay it off? So these kinds of issues are going to be increasingly significant ones. As people get both pushed out, and those that have been pushed out try to get back in. So it's like going like this, and what's that going to look like?
Go ahead, and then we'll.
For the sake of time, I will keep it super simple. I think you said that this ambiguity is a good thing. You should keep people guessing, right? But at the same time, you added that you should make up something. So how do you reconcile the two?
No, I mean, I think that when I say ambiguity, I think I meant more the ambiguity in terms of where it's going. Is this something where people are, where it's an area in decline, where people are moving out in large numbers, where people are getting disillusioned with what's taking place, where there's a where there's a kind of ambiguity in terms of a certain kind of development trajectory. And I know, I know it sounds contradictory, but it also to me to be about something, to have it, to like like this is a place where we make textiles, and we supply a third of the domestic market in jeans. Now, whether or not that's true or not for these areas, I don't know. But at least it's something that tends to psychologically restore the faith that people have in the salience of local institutions. Once somehow that there's a great deal of uncertainty, or the larger city begins to increasingly paint where you live as somehow completely opaque and dangerous, and somehow psychologically people begin to lose faith within the kinds of affiliations with local institutions that they've been affiliated with a very long period of time.
All right, thank you. We have some snacks outside, so people are welcome to join.
Thank you.
Well, thanks again for all coming.